sort of inflection point. I can't quite decide what happens, but I do wonder if Ralph, without Michael there, kind of has a sort of Hightower-Frentzen type career, and effectively their careers invert. Frentzen is at Williams a bit longer, and Ralph is at Jordan a bit longer, and then his career just kind of peters out, maybe winless even.
I do wonder whether it ever happens, and that's not to subscribe to the view that Ralf Schumacher purely got there because of his brother, but because he was a very quick driver, and I will try and defend those who will write off Ralf Schumacher as a terrible driver. He was a very good driver in his day, very, very, very quick. Ask Montoya about how quick Ralf Schumacher was. So it wasn't that he didn't merit a place in F1, but I wonder if the opportunities would have come his way to show what he did sort of later in his junior Formula career as well, if there wasn't the Schumacher connections there as well. And I don't want to say that's a criticism, because I think any driver, to get their opportunity, needs to take advantage of whatever benefits they've got around them. And Ralph absolutely deserved his place in Formula One. But does he get there without Michael Schumacher's role and involvement and just sort of the gravity of that as well? I'm not completely sure. He could have done, because the ability wasn't the problem, but the opportunity surely would have been reduced.
Yeah, I concur. I think that's realistically how it would have been. I think he walked through doors that Michael opened, basically, that Michael's success opened. And as I say, that's not to be disrespectful, but he did have opportunities that probably wouldn't have been there had Michael not sort of knocked the walls down beforehand.
I suppose the thing to wonder, though, is if in this imagined universe where Michael just doesn't exist, is Ralph a bigger deal because Michael doesn't exist, and therefore does that help him a little bit, or does it help him to any degree more than Michael did by just being who Michael was? I think if you just take the career trajectory as is and just imagine Michael's not there, rather than wonder, how much he might have been able to stand on his own 2 feet more without Michael there, or couldn't without Michael being there to help him. I don't see him having the career he had at Williams as Montoya's teammate and winning a few races. Like, maybe he snatches one opportunistic one somewhere, but I could see him being an F1 driver without being a winning F1 driver.
Yeah, it comes down to what cars does he get into in junior categories, and does that lead to further opportunities? Because you kind of count all the way back in terms of that sort of thing. So it's fundamentally a question of, does he get the opportunity to show how good he could become and to develop, which is what I think Michael Schumacher's existence played a part in facilitating, which I stress is not a criticism, because everybody has to take advantage of whatever opportunity they can. It's not like he was a no-hoper who only got there because of his name. That's not how it worked. But you can kind of spin it back endlessly, can't you, in terms of what might have been. And it's a reminder that there's probably quite a few good drivers out there who could win 6 Grand Prix who we have never heard of because they never had the opportunity to develop those talents and sharpen those skills, maybe never even sat in a race car.
4 of those people are sat on this podcast right now. To simplify the question, if Ralph has the career he had and Michael didn't exist, and Ralph notches up the number of wins he had and all that sort of stuff, I do think the perception of what he did is slightly better, because as much as we've tried to say that we're not being disrespectful when we say it probably helped his route to F1 being a Schumacher, I also think it meant he was held to a higher standard than drivers of a similar level, and probably some of his achievements weren't considered as impressive because you're just the second best person in your family at doing this. Next question from Michael Horner, who says, what if David Coulthard had better luck at the start of 2003? Michael goes on to say, DC wins the opening race in Australia. Malaysia, he's running ahead of Kimi in second, but the usual McLaren breaks down on him and Kimi wins. Then in Brazil, DC is on course to win until it's red flagged after he's pitted, with the others still needing to pit. Did Fisichella need to pit again? I suppose maybe he did. So in a more fortunate parallel dimension, DC has 3 wins from 3 starts. That's the point we take here. Does Ron Dennis finally stop seeing him as simply the other driver? Does this lead to a world championship, given the momentum he has? There you go, Mark. David Coulthard has won the first 3 races of the 2003 season. Does that transform the rest of his year?
It certainly obliges McLaren to get right behind him, doesn't it? Which is, it's a very interesting question. But would he have been able to sustain that level of performance? I'd argue probably not. He was definitely the second quickest McLaren driver that year. And there were some special performances coming up from Kimi, and not to mention the juggernaut of Schumacher and Ferrari. So I think, he probably, if we win the first 3 races, he would have been able to retain that lead probably for quite a long way into the season, but I doubt whether it could have been just continue to keep that momentum to enough extension. It wasn't a particularly quick car. It was okay. It was the previous year's car, which they managed to massage into a reasonable competitive shape, but it wouldn't have been done on raw performance, so I don't think it would have been that sustainable.
Just to throw in the detail on Fisichella, he would have had to pit if the race ran the distance, because
I knew you'd have that.
The strategy that Gary Anderson's talked about coming up with was predicated on putting Fisichella in a position where he could be well up the order before having to pit at a point where there's a chance of a red flag and still having the result declared. So accurate to the window, but if it runs to the end, he would have had to stop.
Andy Goulding is next, saying, what are your thoughts on the inconsistency and lack of distinctive helmet designs since the V10 era? I don't normally go down the route, Ed, of allowing us to bash the present. That's not really what we're here for. So it's more a case of using this question to celebrate how distinctive helmet designs were in this era. I remember on the BDV10's Instagram page once, I found a picture that I posted. It was all of the 2005 crash helmets were laid out on some concrete somewhere. I think it was at the Nürburgring, and they were all put together really neatly. And even at that point, so even at the end of the era, when the helmet designs are getting a bit more jazzy, you can still see from any angle, you can work out who everyone's helmet is. That's. I try not to use this phrase on the show, but that was better back then, wasn't it?
Well, I can answer this by taking you on a journey of my own evolving evolving views even. And yeah, certainly, I love the more simple times. Not the most simple times, but like in the 80s and 90s, we had these really clear helmet designs, quite simple striking schemes, instantly recognisable. You had the Hill helmet, the London Rowing Club colours. Alex Caffey's helmet I've talked about before, the red with the gold cross. Loads of drivers had really clear ones, and I like that. Now, what's interesting is there was a point where F1 tried to ban helmet design changes, or rather limit them. So from 2015 to 2019, you're only allowed one change in a season. And I was at the time, I was pro this, and I think I may have even written a column for Autosport arguing for it at one stage. And actually it was a bit rubbish. And what I came to realise is the problem fundamentally is, although there is a force at work in terms of how much more elaborately they can be painted in terms of the techniques, etc., which is what you kind of alluded to, but they were getting more complicated in the era you talked about. But also, you can't really see the helmets very clearly now anymore anyway. You've got the halo, the high cockpit sides, the drivers are really cocooned. So my problem actually is just with, by necessity, for safety reasons, you can't see them as clearly. So I've kind of evolved a little bit to the point where I appreciate why the drivers like doing what they're doing now. They have lots of different changes and they can stamp some personality on it. The only problem is you can only really appreciate most of those designs if you go right up to the helmet and look at it, or look at a really close-up photo, which certainly not many people can go and look at them up close, as obviously we can do sometimes. And it's a great expression of individuality and ideas and that kind of thing. So it's a nice canvas for them to paint on. But I think it all follows from the way the cars are that you kind of can't have it. I'm a little bit unnerved when people change their fundamental colour scheme, because you want to sort of associate, all right, if there's a yellow helmet in that car, that means it's driver X rather than driver Y. So I'm not a huge fan of changes, but also changes happened way back before. Think of Michael Schumacher, had a profound change in his helmet design as well. So yeah, it was better back then from that perspective, but I think the reason is not that drivers are inconsistent and don't have distinctive designs, it's just that you can't see them as clearly fundamentally, and it becomes something, it becomes a different manifestation of it that has to be almost appreciated more as a work of art, if you like. So perhaps it's a slightly colder way of looking at it, but it's just the nature of the beast now, I think.
I'm glad you mentioned the visibility aspect, Ed, because I think that's a big chunk of it. Maybe 50% of it is just the changing of the cars through the era. It's not just the halo now, but just everything. The cars getting bigger, the cockpits going higher, even during the V10 era. Things got harder to see than they used to be when you think of the early 90s and drivers were always hanging out of the car. And I do think the other main key thing is just the fact that the dam was burst in terms of people being able to change their helmets, and I think that never used to be a thing. It was like pick a design and stick with it, and then there was a little bit of commercialisation of the drivers' helmets, but then drivers just chopping and changing all the time, then F1 trying to rein that back in. The drivers, once they've done it, now it just becomes a thing that they still try to do. Even someone like Lewis Hamilton, who has had quite distinctive helmet designs, has chopped and changed even when he didn't need to. And so I just think you've lost that tether between a guy who comes in with his nationalistic or favourite colours and just sticks with them. I mean, even Schumacher, you mentioned, nobody liked that. I didn't like the fact that he changed it, but it's almost an inevitability now that drivers will just do what suits the circumstances, certainly the commercial circumstances. actually the number has become the recognisable thing, hasn't it? You assign numbers rather than have them change based on the championship results, which is another contentious topic, but now that's what you associate with a particular driver rather than a particular helmet design.
Yeah, I'm glad Ed's not as angry about the whole issue as he was, and he's mellowed a little bit. I'd like to go a step further than that and say I don't really care. I liked it when you could instantly recognise it, but I didn't really notice when you couldn't. I think it's probably, and I did like Rennie Arnou's approach to helmet design, which was just plain white, nothing on it at all, which just sort of said, I'm just here to race, I'm not bothered. I did highlight that, so maybe I'm a bit, what's the word, perverse.
Vettel did that too, didn't he? I feel like when he went to Ferrari finally, he went stripped back.
It was plain white with a kind of German stripe down it to begin with, wasn't it? Yeah, a bit more intricate stuff that was in it, like white on grey on white lining and that sort of thing. It was cool. It was cool to see. I always, when we knew Vettel was leaving, we're way outside the era now, but when we knew Vettel was leaving, one of my first thoughts was, what's he going to do if he can't have the Red Bull design? And of course, Vettel really was the pioneer into changing the designs all the time. The one thing he did though is he kept them kind of, they were a family of helmet designs. He just changed like the colours and the designs. But the cork was out of the bottle by that point. Lots more questions to get through. Let's go on, Ed.
I think it's worth noting as well that if you were to speak to a young driver today, let's say a 12-year-old Carter who has the chance to paint his helmet and has to choose his colours, they'd have a completely different view of that process than, say, a young driver in 1990. Because then it's intrinsic to the driver's brand. Now it's something different. It's a manifestation of something else, I think. Even though obviously in karting it's completely visible. But it's not quite the same. So I think people of a certain age, as most of us are, would have a completely different view to a young driver in that regard. There are different ways of manifesting that. And of course, the days when it was absolutely essential to the driver's brand, the days when Coulthard and Hakkinen would turn down £1 million offer from Ron Dennis to get rid of the helmet designs to have sponsorship or whatever, or team ID on it. That probably wouldn't happen in the same way now, and in fact doesn't, as you said from the Red Bull example.
Yeah, so in summary, we're all old. Next question from Chris Parrott, who says, let's say Ferrari does in 2002 what McLaren did in 2003 and never gets the F2002 on track, racing the whole season with the F2001B. How does that year play out? Does Montoya win the 2002 championship? Ben, what do you think?
Well, I think in a season where the rule changes were basically minimal and therefore doing this kind of carryover thing was, I think, much easier for all the teams. Given how together the whole Ferrari team was, as we touched on earlier in the show, how good the 2001 car was, the fact they could put the new engine in it. The thing I'm not sure about is the gearbox development and the air opportunity that presented, how key that was to developing the car through the year, but you'd imagine they'd still be able to develop the old car a bit through the year. The Williams was quick, so Montoya gets all those poles in the middle of the season, but it doesn't. Ferrari using their old car doesn't fix the engine unreliability. The incidents where Montoya drives into Schumacher, they still happen. McLaren is still a basket case. You know, maybe Kimi gets his first win earlier. You know, maybe a few of the races are harder for Schumacher or Ferrari to win. You know, Canada, for example, is that trickier? I just feel like it's inevitably the same result because of how coherent the whole Ferrari operation was, and it just may be that some of the victory margins are a bit smaller.
Yeah, so I'm okay with that. I think we get the same outcome. It's just a bit more interesting along the way. Maybe we'd have done more episodes about 2002 if that was the case. Next question is from Paul Walsh, who says, how did Lotus end up starting the V10 era with a lead driver who went there to continue with Honda, so that'd be Nelson Piquet, a second driver who was backed by Honda, but now they had Judd engines, and that's Satoru Nakajima as well. Ed, does this explain just how going off the rails Lotus was by this point?
Yeah, it's a simple answer. They just went rubbish. And Honda just sort of thought, what's the point? And in fact, it changed Honda's approach in the end, because even when they hooked up with Tyrrell, that was to run the old V10 engines, which Mugen prepared. So that was very much a clear second string. So yeah, it's because Lotus was in pretty bad decline. The results went terrible. So yeah, Honda moved away, and Nakajima just happened to be there for a certain amount of time, and before they could move him across to Tyrrell with that deal. So yeah, it's just the sad decline of a Lotus team that was just falling behind technically, and you kind of get a little bit of a boost where Lotus is able to kind of hang on to being a relevant team after Chapman's gone, but then it just all sort of falls apart like a house of cards. And after they lose Senna, obviously Piquet's their sort of frontline driver, and that doesn't really work either because Piquet isn't the driver he once was. So just a combination of factors, and these all feed into each other, don't they? The results on track aren't as good because you haven't got the driver who's at their peak, and so you don't get money in, and it just turns into this vicious circle. And Honda just thought, no, we don't need to be doing this. This is completely pointless. So it's all part of the rather sad decline of Lotus.
Kevin Butchart's question is next. It's another 1996 one. Kevin says, I've been watching a bit of 1996 on YouTube recently. Michael Schumacher achieved 4 legitimate, fair and square pole positions from only 16 races against the far superior Williams and Benettons in that bin fire of a Ferrari. Is this the greatest overperformance in the V10 era? And if not, what is? Mark, do you think Schumacher's performances in 96, which we touched on earlier with our other 96 question, do they qualify as the greatest overperformance of the era?
I think they do, yeah. I really think they do. That car had no business being anywhere near pole positions and Grand Prix victories. And, you talked to Eddie Irvine about how bad that car was. So it was virtually undrivable. And, Michael's doing things like that. I think that was, in terms of what he was doing behind the wheel, I think that was maybe peak Michael Schumacher that season. So, yeah, I agree.
Joe Fitzsimons has our next question. Ed, this is maybe quite a difficult one. I'm going to throw it to you and see how you get on. Joe says, as a younger fan, can you talk about how Senna was viewed during his career compared to how he's viewed now? Now, this came up in our cross documentary chat that we had, actually, didn't we? We talked about the impact of not only Senna's death, but then things like the Senna film, where Senna, he was already a god, I guess, in Brazil, but it's created, we have a Senna myth now, don't we? How would you say he was actually portrayed at the time?
Yeah, he's been sanctified now, if not deified, as he said. He's not a real human being with real human frailties. Now, looking back at the time, a combination of having watched it at the time, obviously it was through British television and British coverage, so that's a certain perspective, and also what I've read from coverage of the time from also different countries, and you get a view from speaking to people. Senna, he was seen as the gold standard driver, at least once he'd been the star up and comer. He was firmly established, certainly by the time he's at McLaren, as the best driver on the grid. But he didn't have these imperfections kind of whitewashed almost, because he was seen as someone who would push things too far. He would be aggressive on track to the point where some would have seen him as dangerous. And in that regard, I think you could probably draw a comparison today with Max Verstappen. I think he was absolutely, in terms of the perception, the Max Verstappen of the day, seen as someone who is the gold standard of driver, the driver everybody wants to have, but who on occasions will go a little bit too far. Because Senna did make mistakes as well.
Mega popular, but not without his detractors.
Oh, absolutely.
As Max is.
Yeah, he was divisive. There were people who really, really disliked Senna, just as there are with Verstappen. There were people who loved him and would defend him to the hilt. So you'd see a similar sort of thing to Verstappen if that was a social media era. And obviously there was it's a slightly different age. There was a bit more mystery and mystique to the drivers then as well. So that would have played a part for Senna. Also the way he talked about things people quite liked. So there was that sort of extra distance. And also you have to remember different countries. In Brazil, he really was a god because he was someone who he get a lot involved in philanthropic activities in Brazil as well, where there was some terrible poverty to be tackled, still is. And also he was somebody who helped make Brazil, because Brazil sort of got that culture of feeling like it's treated and seen by others as a bit of a second-class nation. But Senna was the guy who really put them on the map. So, okay, you have Brazilian football, but this was in another sporting field when Brazil was right on top and heralded as the gold standard. He wasn't the first Brazilian to do that, but he was an extra step. So, if you are someone in Brazil in 1992 or whatever, they just said something slightly different. But I think you can kind of map him onto Verstappen. So you've seen as the best, but someone who pushed the boundaries and who definitely had his detractors. And like anything, he wasn't seen as perfect, because whenever you have drivers retire and a bit of time passes, people kind of boil them down to a few things, don't they? And the rough edges get ground off. But he was a real human being, Ayrton Senna, and he was seen perhaps a bit more as that at the time than he was now. But certainly he was respected even by those who felt he pushed things too far as an absolutely great driver in terms of what he could do behind the wheel.
Yeah, I think Ed's covered very well the cultural impact he was having even during his lifetime. And if the question is asking whether he was, from a racing perspective, considered in such a mighty way as he has been in hindsight, yeah, absolutely. Even before he got to F1, there was something very, very special, was very, very obvious about Ayrton Senna from Formula 4 through Formula 3. And there was, I think, a certain generation of F1, of the F1 community at that time were probably not that aware of just how special this guy was as he was coming through. And it was quite amusing as a fan watching them be surprised by how sensational he was in the tournament, because it was just so predictable. It was, and I firmly believe that if you put him in an 85 McLaren or Williams, he would have been vying for the World Championship as a rookie. So that was his level. And yeah, he absolutely was considered something quite remarkable, even as he was doing it. It's not just a hindsight thing.
I'm glad Ed made the Verstappen reference, because I remember trying to set up interviews when Max was still relatively new in at Red Bull, and Honda were supplying the team. Well, they're still relatively new at that point. They're building the winning team, if you like. And Honda were making a comparison between Verstappen and Senna, but it was a comparison Verstappen didn't like. It was something that he and Red Bull were very keen to kind of distance themselves from. And I think it does apply in terms of, his obvious otherworldly ability in the car, and also some of the kind of dubious driving tactics that he was prepared to employ. But I think the comparison falls apart a little bit in terms of, his popularity with the media, because I think Senna and Prost was very good on this in the documentary about Prost, that Senna was very good at using the media and having them on the side, whereas I don't think Max is. I think he gets, and has had, quite a rough ride from the media, and also doesn't really care about it too much. He tries to distance himself.
I think that's what it is. He's not interested in putting in the effort, is he?
No.
He doesn't really see the need for it.
No, it's something that just happens, and he's kind of dismissive of it. And also, he doesn't have the spirituality aspect that Senna had. This idea that God protects me in the car, Prost was kind of a little bit afraid of, I think, in terms of where Senna was prepared to go on track. Max is a purely rational driver, as far as I can see. He's much more in the kind of Schumacher camp in terms of being, more technically focused and trying to strip away, maybe even Kimi Raikkonen actually, in terms of trying to strip away all the other stuff and the things that distract me from what I'm doing in the car.
There was the mention earlier of what Senna fandom would have been like in the social media era. We had a taste of that earlier in this series. We did Suzuka 90. We suggested quite strongly that what Ayrton did at the first corner at Suzuka to Prost might not have been the finest piece of driving you'll ever see. And there are plenty of Senna fans, many of whom probably never saw him race live, and they felt very strongly about our decision to criticise him for that. So we've lived a little bit of it, and it doesn't make me want to. It makes me glad social media wasn't around during the real Senna Prost stuff. Let's finish with a great question from John Ayres, who has put together his own classic V10s calendar. He says it should always consist of 16 races, and asked what would be our 16 race V10 era calendar. But I'm going to set the scene with John's calendar and then see if anybody wants to adjust or improve it, because I think John's done a really good job. So we've got 16 races here. We're starting the season with the Brazilian Grand Prix in Interlagos. Round 2 is the Malaysian Grand Prix. Round 3 at the San Marino Grand Prix at pre-95 Imola, so the pre-chicanes version of Imola. Round 4 is Monaco. Round 5 is the Spanish Grand Prix at Barcelona. Round 6 is the Canadian Grand Prix, specifically the 1992 version, so a slightly bendier version of Montreal. Round 7, Mexican Grand Prix, obviously on a slightly different version of the track to what we have today. Round 8 is the British Grand Prix on the 1991 version of Silverstone. Round 9 is Hockenheim, the German Grand Prix, 1990 Hockenheim, if I remember right, that's slightly faster chicanes back then. Next up is the Hungarian Grand Prix on the 2003 onwards spec of Hungary, so when they sharpened up a few of the corners to try and make the racing better. Then we've got Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, circuit version not specified, which is interesting, because Spa did go through quite a few changes even in the V10 era, so I'm going to pick the version of Spa that we had until about, 2001, when they started messing around with the bus stop. So we're going for what we consider original V10s Spa. 2000s onwards version of Monza for the Italian Grand Prix. There were chicane changes that year. Round 13, Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril, 1991 version. So again, fastest version of Estoril. Round 14 is the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. And again, this is the 2002 Nürburgring. So that's the first corner with a hairpin rather than an S-bend. We're almost there. Round 15, and you have to finish with these final two races, I think. Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, 1989 spec. And we're finishing with the Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide. I think that is a great effort effort, and it took me quite a while to think of any suggestions that we could change. In terms of it being the classic calendar, I think you could debate if a French Grand Prix should be in there, but I perhaps see why one isn't, because you're stuck with short Paul Ricard or various versions of Manicourt, so I can see why you go for Mexico instead. And I do think the original Mexico, or not the original, the version of Mexico City we had in the early V10 era was a great track. Ed, I see your hand has gone up. Any changes you'd make to this calendar from John?
Well, I totally agree. It's an excellent calendar, and I like the fact it's 16 races. That's the correct bring back V10 0 number of races as well. But mentioning the France, I would actually say Manicourt, which I know I may be in the minority on, but I actually think it was a pretty good track.
Which version?
Oh, I hadn't really thought about the version. Probably.
There's 3 to choose from. So remember, it had an extra twist after the hairpin at the beginning. They straightened that out, and then you've got the changes they made at the end of the era that created what I guess we can call Jarno Trulli Corner.
Yeah, I quite like the late version, actually. I quite enjoyed the later version of
So you're getting rid of the final chicane.
Yeah, I think that would probably be reasonable, but there's a lot of bits in that track I quite like. So I'm basically arguing for 2 changes, which is Manicourt in, the A1 ring in, which I think got a bad rap because it wasn't the Österreich ring, but actually it's a really, really nice, fun, interesting circuit where always stuff happens. So I'm arguing those 2 in, and I'm saying Nürburgring out, because I'm saying we don't need a European Grand Prix, and actually the Nürburgring is quite a nice track, but I'm now going to flip the argument there. It's not the Nordschleife, and I think it's a losable track. And I'm also perhaps slightly harshly saying Estoril out as well as part of that, which is slightly controversial, I know. But I thought about Barcelona out actually, because it's a very good Formula One car track, but I'm not sure it produced great races. Whatever happens, there's got to be an Iberian Peninsula race. Whatever happens,
They can rotate.
So we could argue, exactly, we could argue if it's Barcelona or Estoril, but those are the 2 I wanted in, and the 2 I took out. But I do like as well the start into Lagos and the end in Adelaide as well. I think they've done well there. I tried to create a calendar of the other end of the scale of the worst bring back V10 era tracks, because there's only enough for 15, so there's only 31 tracks. But I won't offer that right now.
We'll put that on Patreon.
I'm glad you mentioned the A1 ring, Ed, because I think that deserves a shout. I would probably, if we have to be swapping races out, I also would like Jerez, and maybe the Spanish Grand Prix becomes Jerez, because I just always found Barcelona boring, and then maybe the European Grand Prix can be the A1 ring, because I never really liked the Nürburgring, to be honest. So I definitely would lose those 2, but maybe you can make a case for adding, because there were 17 race seasons in the mid-90s, and I know it wasn't that popular, but I want to put an honourable mention in for the Argentinian Grand Prix. I was kind of happy when that was on the calendar, a bit disappointed when it left, and I thought it was quite a decent track. Actually, I certainly prefer that track to say Magny-Cours, which I agree you kind of have to have because it's a classic race. But if you're just doing your ideal and not really taking too much account of kind of prestige, then I'd happily lose the French Grand Prix as the question did.
Yeah, I think if we were to just list our 16 favourite tracks, some of these wouldn't get in. I mean, Barcelona in the V10 era, it started off well with those kind of rain-affected races in 91 and 92, but after that, pretty forgettable for much of the era. But yeah, our hats off to you, John. An incredible effort with this calendar, and I think you've really captured the spirit of what a V10 era calendar should be about. Good point though, Ben, about your cheat code for the fact that we could have 17 races. I remember the first 17 race season of the era was 95, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember it blew my mind as a young fan that it was going to be an extra Grand Prix, because all I knew at that point was 16 race seasons, which does sometimes make me wonder how I'd feel if I was a young fan now about there being 24 races. But we'll end it there. Thank you, Mark, Ed and Ben for tackling these questions for us. As I said at the beginning, we'll do some members-only Q&As between now and season 13, which will be in the new year, so we can get through we'll scratch a bit deeper at the surface of the nearly 200 questions we've had. And if the thought of going without Bring Back V10s until the new year fills you with absolute dread, then come join us in the Race Members Club. I've drawn up a plan of bonus episodes. I am waiting for it to get approved, but if it doesn't get approved, I'll just force it through. We're effectively going to be releasing an episode every single week between this one coming out and Christmas. So if you need your weekly Bring Back V10s fix, there is a way to get it. It's very reasonably priced. Come check out the Race Members Club on Patreon. And with that, if you're a member with us, I don't need to say see you at the start of season 13. I need to say probably see you next week.
Wir aan de wet als je ervoor op de vlucht bent?
We moeten ervoor zorgen dat het allemaal zo snel mogelijk weer wordt vastgezet.
Waar vind je vrijheid als je aan het vechten bent om te overleven?
Ja, ik ga niet zitten wachten tot er een granaat op elkaar komt.
Wanneer verandert een vriend in een vijand?
Wat heb je daarvoor over?
Action. De nieuwe serie Sugar, Ride or Die. Alleen op Prime Video. Met onder andere Gijs Naber, Elise Schaap, Sally Harmsen en Teun Kouboer.
Zou je er nou iemand wandelen? Nou, wat toevallig. Want wandelen is onwijs gezond. Daarom helpt ASR als trotse hoofdsponsor van de avondvierdaagse het hele jaar door om wandelen makkelijker en leuker te maken. Op asr.nl/aan de wandel vind je de leukste wandelroutes en bij welke producten je beloond kan worden voor wandelen. Dit doet ASR voor jou en een gezondere samenleving. ASR doet het. Zo, dan wandelen we nu lekker door naar je podcast.
The Athletic.
Not many classic F1 partnerships get to end on a high, but Juan Pablo Montoya of Williams got to do just that at the end of a difficult 2004 season, when he signed off with victory in the Brazilian Grand Prix before heading off to McLaren. Montoya came out on top in a close run battle with his future teammate Kimi Raikkonen, while that year's dominant champion Michael Schumacher was nowhere on a scrappy final weekend of the season. It was also the weekend when David Coulthard said goodbye to McLaren after 9 years together. Jenson Button found out he'd be forced to stay with BAR rather than move to Williams for 2005, and F1 announced short-notice rule changes for 2005 and the arrival of V8 engines for 2006. Boo. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, to look back on all of that and more, we have Ben Anderson and John Noble. Ben, kick things off for us. When you think of Brazil 2004, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
I think back to being in the first year of university in Sheffield in my dingy, soon-to-be demolished halls of residence, crowded around a really small bedroom TV, tuned into the coverage, watching the race with new friends who weren't as into Formula One as I was and were kind of a bit puzzled while I was giving up this time drinking with them to watch a Formula One race in Brazil.
Yeah, so you're trying to be the expert in the room.
Again, still trying.
Yeah, how's that going for you 20 years later?
It's a struggle.
Yeah. John, how about you?
I remember photos of a donkey on the driver photograph chair, which I'm sure we will cover later on. But primarily, Montoya's final win. I just think it was quite an intriguing time. End of one era for him, the start of what should have been a great new era. Didn't quite pan out that way. But I think it ended what I thought was quite a fascinating chapter of Formula One, the Montoya-Williams spell.
Yeah, we'll come back to that much later on. But the big news heading into the final weekend of the 2004 season came from the Contract Recognition Board, which ruled that Jenson Button would have to stay with BAR for 2005 rather than making his desired switch to Williams. We've covered this in great detail with the help of then BAR boss David Richards in our Button 2004 episode back in season 3. So we'll just touch on it briefly here to refresh your memories. Button said he was disappointed to have to stay at BAR, and he believed he was advised slightly incorrectly, while Williams felt vindicated by the CRB accepting a significant number of Williams' arguments, and Williams were not ordered to pay BAR's costs. Button told Nigel Roebuck in December that he didn't regret his reasons for trying to move, and Frank Williams said Williams had no regrets either because it felt Button was a driver worth challenging for. Richards said in Brazil that BAR and Button had repairing to do behind the scenes, especially as so much of this dispute had been aired in public. John, on that final point, did you think that the Button-BAR relationship could be repaired, especially as at this stage Williams and Button were still adamant they'd just get together instead for 2006?
I think it would have been tricky if things had carried on, because clearly Jenson and DR didn't see eye to eye on many things. I think different personalities, different eras. DR had been through multiple kind of relationships and flashpoints of drivers in his career, and wasn't afraid to stand firm in he went. In the end, DR left BAR in the season when Honda came in, and obviously Honda's conviction to join BAR would have alleviated one of Jenson's concerns about wanting to leave. He was worried it wasn't a manufacturer team and Williams a better set. So I think in the end it worked out because DR left and you could kind of park all those frictions away with new team boss Nick Fry and close relationship with Honda. So I think it was quite easy. But I think it would have been more difficult if DR had stayed around and rolled on into 2005.
Also handy that early in 2005, I think everyone in the paddock had wind of the fact that Williams were probably about to lose that manufacturer status with BMW. But this ruling left Williams still looking for a second driver to partner new signing Mark Webber, as Juan Pablo Montoya and Ralf Schumacher were off to McLaren and Toyota respectively for 2005. Test driver Antonio Pizzonia, who stood in for 4 races earlier in the year when Ralf was injured, he was in the running for the seat, but so was, bizarrely, 2-time world champion Mika Häkkinen. Williams' Patrick Head explained at the time that the team's logic was that it might need a driver with a proven track record to slot in alongside Webber, as while Williams believed Webber could go on to be a top driver, by 2004 he didn't have a CV full of great achievements. Head accepted that turning to Häkkinen would be a risk after he'd been out of F1 since retiring or going on sabbatical at the end of 2001. But Patrick said you have to think seriously about a man who has the talent to twice beat Michael Schumacher to win the title. Häkkinen hasn't spoken about this too often, but he did mention it briefly on F1's Beyond the Grid podcast, saying Frank Williams was the one to call him about the idea, and while Mika briefly thought this could be interesting, in the end, too many things didn't match, and he was glad he didn't do it because it wasn't a good idea and it would have been a mistake. Ben, was Mika right? How do you think he would have gone alongside Webber in 2005 and in 2005 Williams?
I think he was right. Definitely right to be a bit sceptical about the whole thing. I mean, not really many drivers make a good fist of being out of Formula One for an extended period and coming back and doing a good job. I mean, Alonso's probably the recent exception. Kimi Raikkonen